Okay. So we have some really nice material today. We're still in the Enlightenment, the 18th century, the 1700s. What we're going to look at today are novels, English novels from the 1700s. The thing though about novels in the 1700s is they don't know that they're novels yet. I mean, the 1700s, the 18th century is the century where the genre of novels, such an important genre for people in the 20th and 21st century, even still, first takes its form. And you'll notice about all of the books that we look at today that there are elements that are sort of not like contemporary novels. They're all of the books that we'll look at today are books that if you were naive enough, you wouldn't necessarily know that it was a novel. It seems as if all of the books, the English novels from the 19th century, are masquerading as other things. And there's some real depths to that. But part of the reason for that effect is because they're not really quite sure that they are novels. We'll look at one representative of a group of English writers who really are definitely the first novelists. Let's share the screen. I got to look around here because I got this big clunky thing because I'm such a terrible technician. Okay. The rise. Here we go. Sorry. Pardon my French. Right. As I say, the rise of the novel. The rise of the novel, not just in the sense of the novel becoming popular, although novels were extremely popular. The 18th century English public was a reading public. They had their noses in reading material all the time. Of course, there was no electronic media of any kind or anything like that. So everyone was reading these pamphlets and books and all kinds of stuff, and also writing. These people wrote letters every single day and received letters every single day. Educated people in the 18th century. Some of these people left behind in their estates tens of thousands of letters. So this is fiction in Enlightenment England. It's a wonderful period, as I say, because it's not, everything isn't settled and there's all kinds of experimentation going on. In a way, it's a much more sort of rowdy scene than the one that we find in England 100 years later. So yes, as I mentioned, that 18th century English reader. Now, a lot of things, of course, you have the new science and a great interest in the new science. The reading public is an educated public, and there are all kinds of pamphlets all over the place. There are notably, and we'll see as we go through all of the books that we'll look at today, these travelogues, travel narratives coming from all around the world. We've had a couple centuries of exploration. Now you have a new sort of scientific attitude towards nature studies, and you're getting all kinds of accounts of animals and tribes and all kinds of stuff. In that flow is all kinds of phony stuff. Some of it's just hack stuff written by people who just want to cash in, and some of it turns into sort of very serious cultural artifacts. And there are, of course, nonfiction works as well. The literature of exploration is really also quite well worth looking into. And the streets of London are filled with these pamphlets. And not only that, but 17th century England is a partisan political place. There is the intrigue going on all the time with the crown. Various things are happening, but you have the Whigs and the Tories. It's best when we're looking at the 18th century not to worry about which one's right wing and which one's left wing. They sort of switch around, the Whigs and the Tories. Later on, it becomes a little better defined. But from our point of view, it's a little bit remote, the 1700s. Don't worry about who the Whigs are and who the Tories are. A lot of the people that we're looking at today were very slippery fellows who went back and forth between the two parties and were double agents. There's all kinds of daring do happening because what we're looking at here is media, mass media. That's a big part of what we're talking about here, the impact of the printing press and the rise of these genres and the way that the information is moving around and the way that people are using and exploiting these genres and this new technology for various reasons, including political purposes. And one thing that's happening is you've got all kinds of pamphleteers who are not who they seem, who are writing pamphlets which they know are too extreme, or are writing pamphlets which they know contain odious ideas deliberately to provoke a backlash. There's a lot of sabotage going on. And if you were a public writer in the 1700s in London, certainly, you would get involved in it. And we'll see how that happens with a couple of the writers that we look at today. So we live in a time when mass media technology is very important to us, a little bit threatening. We see we're in a period of transition. It's tremendously powerful. And it's something that we think about a lot, and it's something that we spend a great deal of time on, our social media and our cell phones and all that stuff. The 18th century Londoner, the middle class educated 18th century London resident, was in exactly the same situation vis-a-vis media. Everything I just said about mass media was true about them and their concerns as well. And because it's coming up, it's fascinating because I say these novels don't know that they're novels. They're inchoate novels. They're novels gelling into novels, and they're also very experimental. I think, and in that way, as I say in that last point on the slide there, when we get up into the 19th century, the 1800s, with Dickens and the crowd and the gang, we get a very intense kind of social realism. But we don't have that in the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment's kind of wide open, and especially in England, there's a kind of, in France, you know, the modern ideas are very heavily weaponized. I mean, everything's very trendy and politicized in France all the time. In England, it's a little bit more, as the English would take a great deal of pride in, a little bit more eccentric, a little bit more indirect, the way that they're processing some of these new scientific and new secular ideas. So look at some of these people. Daniel Defoe. Now, Daniel Defoe's own life, he's one of these people like Cervantes. His own personal life was so wild that you could just talk about that for a long time. He had a interesting childhood. He became a pamphleteer. He ran businesses, he managed factories, he bounced around, he did a lot of things. But he realized that he could make money as a pamphleteer. And Defoe was one of the first successful newspaper publishers. That whole tradition, when you watch the old movies, is extra, read all about it. And you got the paper boys out on the street selling the papers. I know a lot of you seeing this video don't even, never even saw that. But Daniel Defoe in the beginning of the 1700s was one of the first people to do that. And he did make a lot of money. He saw himself as a businessman. And a lot of the things that he did for money. He wrote over 500 pamphlets about all kinds of things. A lot of it was just Defoe talking about whatever he wanted to. But a lot of it was also stuff that he did for money. Now, he was pilloried a couple times. Now, what is it to be pilloried? You're put in the stocks out on the street, and people can throw vegetables at you, rotten vegetables if they want. And you spend a day or two in the pillory. This actually happened to Daniel Defoe a couple times because Queen Anne took the throne, and she was cracking down on nonconformists. Nonconformists being people who are Protestants, not Catholics, and who are not only that, but who are not conforming to the Church of England, the Anglican Church. Defoe is one of those people. Defoe was given a nonconformist dissident education as a child. So Defoe writes one of these satirical things. It's like the thing about a lot of what we're looking at here, there's like a website like The Onion, and The Onion will have a newspaper headline that looks like it's real, and it says something outrageous like, Supreme Court says, gay marriage for all, or just something crazy. And you go, what? And then it's The Onion, and it's making fun, and it got you. And The Onion, actually, the satirical website I'm talking about, has fooled some people like the Republican Party, the Iranian government several times, because the people are so square that they don't get it, that it's a satire. And Defoe wrote, The Shortest Way with the Dissenters. Remember, really, what is he? Really, he is a dissenter. He is one of these people. but he publishes an anonymous pamphlet. The other thing was, it was conventional, it was tradition to publish the pamphlets anonymously. At first, people thought they should publish their opinion pamphlets or their instructional pamphlets anonymously because they thought that was sort of humble, that, and then after a while, people also realized it might be a good idea, depending on what you were publishing, not to draw attention to yourself. But this allowed for this kind of deceptive satire where you try to yoke somebody in and fool somebody by pretending to be somebody that you're not and saying something that's really outrageous and seeing if they'll agree with it and buy it, and therefore be embarrassed. And Defoe was a master at that. So this happens to Defoe. He goes in the pillory. There's a myth that because of a poem that he wrote, people threw flowers rather than vegetables. Probably people didn't really throw anything at all. But after that, the Queen's people come to Defoe and they say, look, we could use you. You are identified as anti-papist, as anti this regency, and we could use you to plant false pamphlets because you are a respected voice. And for example, they were trying to get the Act of Union passed to get Scotland under the United Kingdom, part of Great Britain, with England. And they sent Defoe up there, and he was up there a long time. Defoe goes up there. He is, supposedly a champion of Scottish nationalism. These are the people who he's hanging out with. If they had known that he was a double agent, they, as someone wrote in a letter, they certainly would have killed him. And he was there for a long time writing these double agent pamphlets, which actually were designed to spread disinformation and demoralize the Scottish nationalists. And as a matter of fact, some historians think that Daniel Defoe, the secret agent who was writing these phony pamphlets, was actually one of the main forces that turned that around, and they got the Act of Union passed, whereas about 2 years prior to that, Scottish sentiment had been dead set against it. And as I say, there are historians who think that was mostly Defoe's doing, working for the Queen and her organization that is after all kind of threatening him and coercing him, but he's doing it for money. And then at the age of 59, I love these stories when the guy gets kind of old and then he starts doing masterpieces, I mean, that's just really, that's a good thing. He's after 1719, when he's about 59 years old, Defoe just decides to put his nose to the grindstone and write, and he writes just a series of novels, including Robinson Crusoe and Moll Flanders. These are, a bucket of blood novels about people having all kinds of adventures with pirates and getting kidnapped and getting wrecked at sea and finding their long lost, mother after 40 years. I mean, and this kind of stuff. I mean, they're mostly a lot of the stuff we're looking at today. The way this stuff was written in the streets of London in the 1700s was by pamphlet, and sometimes by subscription. You could pay and you'd get one yourself every day, or if you were just someone who went down to the city to work every day, you could buy one on the street. And so they were published in these installments, which were lucrative for the authors if they could keep it up. Here's an engraving from the 19th century of Daniel Defoe in the pillory. I believe they're claiming that they're throwing flowers at him. As I say, it seems as if they're probably neither side of the story is entirely true. But he was pilloried 3 times, which is a lot, for just getting in trouble with the Queen. So the book that we want to talk about is Robinson Crusoe. You may have heard of Robinson Crusoe. You may have seen with Robinson Crusoe, like with Gulliver, as with Gulliver's Travels, the Jonathan Swift novel we're going to talk about in a minute, that it seems like maybe it's a young adult or children's book, an adventure book, something you might see a cartoon version of. Robinson Crusoe with meeting the native out on the island where he's stranded for 28 years. But in fact, there's a lot more to the novel than that sort of cartoonish version. The thing is, let me work through the slide here, I guess, so we can read that as well. If you just about any version of Robinson Crusoe you're going to get is going to be a very, very abridged version. It's a paperback book that people buy because they think it's, as they say, an adventure book, maybe a young adult book. You'll get a short paperback edition of it. The original Robinson Crusoe is a pretty big book, but it has all these documents, and that's the thing. It's really like it's all made up, but it's made up, and it's got all these lists and inventories. He's got his goats. He keeps track of how many goats that he has. He builds things. He builds little walls. He makes a throwing wheel for his pottery. And he writes it. He keeps track of everything. He writes everything down in this diary that he makes. And so as the years go by, he's got these huge inventories, and he's got the statistics on things like an accountant, right? And so the actual original manuscript of the actual original book is, in that sense, really very eccentric. Most people who encounter Robinson Crusoe would never know about that if they didn't look at the first edition of it. And what would be the point of all that? Because it's really fairly bizarre, because remember, it is all fiction. He made it all up. Remember, Defoe, now this is something to think about when we think about Defoe as the fiction writer, the novelist. Defoe, who we know, is the secret double agent writing pamphlets that appear to have one kind of opinion and are really pushing in some other kind of direction. You know, this is what he does. He doesn't know that he's a novelist. He's a writer. He writes for money, and what do you want him to do? And what is Robinson Crusoe really? Robinson Crusoe, the least, let me step out of this for just a second. Of the four writers we're looking at today, Daniel Defoe, and then Jonathan Swift, and then Henry Fielding, and then Lawrence Sterne. And Defoe really is by far the most sort of nationalistic, pro-England kind of one amongst them. The other three are all very kind of subversive and socially critical. But what's Daniel Defoe really doing in Robinson Crusoe? What's the real social and political significance of this linguistic artifact, Robinson Crusoe? What he is doing is showing that this Protestant Englishman is out there, and you drop him down into the wilderness, which here, by the way, they've been getting these real life shipwreck stories about around the mouth of the Orinoco River, where it comes out of Venezuela, north coast of South America, where the Devil's Island was and all that. That's where he has set this. So the Protestant Englishman, you drop him down in the wilderness in the middle of nowhere, and he gets to work. He believes in works, right? He believes in trade. He believes in husbandry. So what does he do? He starts building things. He starts making barrels, and he starts making lobster traps, and he starts catching goats, and he starts building shanties out of things. And pretty soon he's got a whole big thing going. I mean, this is the idea. And of course, there are these kind of cannibalistic savages, and someone who escaped from them, Friday, who's with them for a while. And clearly, as we were talking about in that Enlightenment, slavery and equality video, there's a sort of racial supremacism, a racial supremacism and a justification of slavery kind of at work here. Something that happens coming into modernity in the early modern period, speaking of slavery, just one more thing about that, is that slavery in many cultures and times was a sort of general thing. In the ancient classical world, you could fall into slavery by falling into debt or by having your city lose a war or something like that. It really wasn't about your ethnicity. And this modern day racism around the slave trade, it sort of coalesces and defines itself as a kind of race-based justification for slavery, or racism, right? Racism, the idea that one race is superior to another race. And so that's, this kind of racism that's consistent with these naturalistic Enlightenment ideas. And as I say, that's something we really want to understand. So here's Daniel Defoe. He's the big propagandist for Protestant England. He's pro-empire. He's self-consciously in favor of increasing consumption because he thinks that's going to increase demand. Of course, he's got these kinds of ideas. And so that's what this incredible document really is about. And he has lots of other daring do's and adventures before he gets back to England. So Daniel Defoe and his novel Robinson Crusoe, definitely both examples of not exactly what they may seem. Okie dokie. And there's the front page of that. I'm going to show you the front pages of all these as we go through here. And notice that here it doesn't, I don't believe anywhere it says on there that it's written by anyone named Daniel Defoe. It says it's written by Robinson Crusoe, and it's written by himself. So presented as a real travel story. They were getting real travel stories, travel narratives, even about people who had been shipwrecked for years. So Defoe drops this one on the market. We know that he's really interested in making as much money as he can with these things. And so there it is. Somebody who's, living on the media. Jonathan Swift. My personal favorite, I have to say, of all of these people here is Jonathan Swift. I think he's one of my favorite English language writers. He's a satirist, a master satirist. He's completely engaged. He's really funny. He's really modern. He doesn't have really any inhibitions. He's polite. He's a clergyman. He's religious. He's in some ways sort of small c conservative. Jonathan Swift is a member of the Anglo-Irish elite. Lawrence Sterne, who we're going to also look at today, another member of the Anglo-Irish elite. What is that Anglo-Irish elite? In the late 1600s, during the interregnum period of Oliver Cromwell, there was great incursions on Ireland from England. England had already seized a lot of Ireland, but at that point in the late 1600s, you really get big estates taking over and pushing the Irish peasants off their lands. And of course, this is setting up what you're going to see in the future after that, including the Irish famine of the early 1800s, 1840s. And Jonathan Swift is upper class. So the Anglo-Irish refer to these English people who came over as essentially colonizers, many of them quite recently at this point in the 1600s, taking over these estates. You get the wool market, and so you want to clear off the land so you can run sheep on it to get your wool, and that pushes out small Irish farmers. And this is all done in a very sort of merciless way for a long time. The history of Ireland under the English is really sad. So Swift is the Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin. He's a very high-ranking member of the clergy of the Church of Ireland, which is part of the Anglican Church, the Church of England. I've been to the church in Dublin. It actually was a Catholic church way back when. It was taken over, of course, by the Protestants at some point, and that's the church over which Swift presided. So very upper class and English, but Swift, he spent his life in Ireland, and he was very, very appalled by the treatment of the Irish and by English prejudice against the Irish people, against the Catholic people. He thought that was terrible. And so one of the things he did was to write a modest proposal. When we talk about satire, now the modest proposal, and this is prophetic because it's really not until over 100 years after he writes a modest proposal that you actually get the big famine, the Irish potato famine in the 1840s, that kills about 25% of the population and drives about another 25% overseas, mostly to the United States. And so Swift puts out a pamphlet on the streets of London, anonymous, saying, well, I know what we could do because, everyone's sad because there's all this unemployment in Ireland and there's all these Irish children. The Irish are Catholic, okay, so they have all these babies, so the Protestants look down on them for having all the babies because they're Catholics, all that. So that's part of the prejudice against the Irish, right, from the Protestant English. So, so he says, well, there's all these babies, and there's not enough food in Ireland, and they need a cash export, and the only thing they really export anyway is Irish people. So maybe we should just eat the Irish babies. And he has some recipes for Irish baby, just to help out. And so, and that, as I say, is, folks, satire. That's what satire is. And there's, no matter how outrageous it is, there's somebody out there. There was somebody out there in 1700s London who said, jolly good, yeah, it was a good idea, or something like, and lots of people said, oh my God, and thought that he actually was serious, because that's how satire works. And as I said, there's really hardly any better satirist than Jonathan Swift. But his masterpiece, now here we, yeah, frontispiece is the two book we're talking about here. On the left, Modest Proposal. Again, notice originally published anonymously, doesn't say who it is. And then on the right, you have Gulliver's Travels. Doesn't say Gulliver's Travels, it says Travels to Several Remote Nations of the World by Lemuel Gulliver, ship surgeon. Just like this is him. So notice, and then all three of the frontispieces of the books that we've seen, the one by Defoe and the two by Swift, none of them actually say who the real author is. All of them say, no, this is this other thing. So Gulliver's Travels. Now, yes, I wouldn't, as I've said before, I'm definitely not cynical. The literature stuff is some of my favorite stuff. Teaching literature in humanities is a little bit weird, because it's a little bit broadcasting to outer space, because that a lot of the people, after all, aren't going to actually read the four novels that we talk about, and I know that. But we're here to enrich ourselves, and we're not hoity-toity, and that's okay. We want to know a little bit about something. However, I would seriously recommend that you do get your hands on an original, unabridged copy of Gulliver's Travels, original unabridged, so it has all the sex and drugs and rock and roll and all the other earthy stuff. He uses all of these sort of science fiction locales where Gulliver goes through a series of shipwrecks. For example, in Brobdingnag, where he's only just a couple inches tall compared to the locals, they build this little box for him, this little house box for him to carry him around. The way he gets off there is an eagle grabs it and carries it out to sea and drops it, and then he gets picked up. So he has all these kinds of wild stories between all of these places. But first of all, he says he went to a place where the people were all 4 inches tall. They were fighting, the Lilliputians were fighting with these people on this other island, and they wanted Gulliver to go over there and smash them all. And Gulliver was kind of appalled by this. He didn't see why these little people took themselves so seriously. Eventually, there's a fire in the palace, and so Gulliver doesn't know what to do. So he pisses on the palace to put the fire out, but he pisses on the royal bedrooms. And so they think that's too disrespectful, and they make him go away. The next place he goes to, though, the people are 40 feet tall, and he's just a little guy. And he gets found in a field, and the farmer starts showing him to people for money until he gets sent up to the palace. And there, the people of the palace, the princess and her friends, are playing with them. And you see something in Swift that's pretty striking is his misanthropy. Misanthropy meaning what? Meaning a certain distaste for the human race in general. And misogyny, a certain distaste or repulsion around women. Misanthropy, I think in Swift's case, like Heraclitus, I think in Swift it's really a more general misanthropy. He just doesn't like people. Then he goes to La Puta and Balnibarbi. By the way, he didn't speak Spanish. Okay, so give me a break here, folks. La Puta is a city of intellectuals that floats on a cloud and rules Balnibarbi. They just, from the Labutians just throw rocks down all the Balnibarbians when they need to. And the Laputans think that they're very superior because they have wonderful science. Because again, this is a critique of the sort of fetishizing science of the Enlightenment, right? And so they're all sort of these stargazers, and they're trying to get sunbeams out of cucumbers and all kinds of stuff like that. While meanwhile the people are miserable. So not looking at practical things, but claiming that they're doing science. Lugnag's kind of interesting. There's Jorge Luis Borges' story, The City of the Immortals, where the people are immortal and never die. But the horrible thing there, of course, is that they become very, very old, and it's a terrible way to live. But where he got that actually from Swift, I think Borges would say that. He loved Swift. Lugnag is where this is. The people never die, they're immortal, so that's great, except that they just get older and older and older. And after a while, they just legally declare everybody dead when they're 80, And the last one, I was talking about his sort of misanthropy. He goes to the land of the Houyhnhnms. Why Houyhnhnms? Because they're horses. And it's like, like the neighing or whinnying of a horse. I don't know how they do that in Spanish. And, I read these Mexican comic books and they're saying like, ack, 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 doesn't look like it's what a horse does to me. But so anyway, the Houyhnhnms. But the Houyhnhnms are intelligent, civilized, cultured, empathetic, the horses. But you better watch out for the yahoos. They live up in the trees and they'll throw their shit at you if you go up to them. They're nasty. And these are what the humans are. In real life, at the very end of his life, Jonathan Swift didn't like to see any people because he thought that they smelled bad. He sort of went demented, and part of it was that he thought that the real guy who thought that human beings were disgusting. So in Gulliver's Travels, I mean, it's a satire. It's something a little darker than a satire. Swift goes a little farther than mere satire or mere politics in Gulliver's Travels. He's really talking about the human condition and some of the pettiness of people or hopelessness of people in the face of the human condition. He's going for bigger game than just satirizing this thing or that thing. Gulliver being tied up by the Laputians while he sleeps. He washes up, and when he wakes up, he's tied up. It's one of the more famous. Again, it was a very eschatological, talks about shit, it talks about violence, it talks about sex a lot. So Gulliver's Travels in the 19th century was kind of deliberately sort of cleaned up and made into basically a children's book, and they just sort of abridged a lot of stuff out of it. And then it was later when people got interested again, and it was excavated and people realized the importance of the book. Here's a painting of Gulliver being exhibited to people by the farmer. You can see other people outside. There's the city of you-know-what up flying up in the air. I think there's a Star Trek about that. And here's the folks, the Lugnugs, who never die. Wouldn't it be wonderful to be immortal? Well, looks good on paper. And finally, the very intelligent and good conversationalists, Houyhnhnms, who are quite taken aback to see a Yahoo who's civilized. At first, they don't believe it. They don't believe that a Yahoo can speak politely and behave himself and so on. He's an oddity. He's a freak. All right, so highly recommending then that to actually take a look at Gulliver's Travels. I know that most of you are not going to get a chance to read all these books, and some of you are doing fine, and you're not even going to have to look at any of these books. And I know that. I live in reality too. But Gulliver's Travels is actually quite worth looking at if you enjoy reading, and then you need to look at it. So Henry Fielding representing a sort of whole area of writers of the 1700s. Another one would be Tobias Smollett. These are the people who really worked the novel up into its mature form. With them, we see a novel that's a finished piece with a beginning, a middle, and end, and a clear narrative. With Defoe and Swift, you're looking at series of things. They're experimental. They're doing all kinds of stuff with these other novelists, and they're writing. Now you've got one thing you've got by the middle, of getting towards the middle of the century is you've got a big reading public, and they like to be entertained. As with all of these, one thing that does make Fielding similar to the other writers that we're looking at today is he certainly is a social satirist. He certainly is making political comments. And in fact, Fielding, as a younger man, wrote political plays, political theater that was so inflammatory that many people think he actually provoked the theatrical licensing act by which the authorities in London could give the thumbs up or thumbs down to plays, whether they could be produced or not. And some people think it was because of Fielding because he was too political, too aggressive. Well, Tom Jones then, the novel that we'll look at is Tom Jones. Epic sweep, many years go by. It's all about his family. A lot of these novels dealing with social status and property and having to do with inheritance and people standing in the family. This is a big theme in all of English literature through the 1700s and 1800s, in fact. And Tom Jones is a bastard son of the larger estate of Squire Allworthy, himself a wonderful, saintly, if perhaps at times somewhat oblivious, Englishman. But Blifil, his half-brother, is by marriage actually part of the estate. So he has that, although they're half-brothers, Blifil has more status and more claim to things than Tom does. And Blifil and his evil father torment Tom quite a bit. However, they're jerks, and Tom is not. And Tom goes roving around the countryside, having all kinds of adventures, including adventures with various bored housewives and young milkmaids and people. And what's that all about? I mean, obviously it's selling books. It's popular. People like to read it. But also Tom is embodying this new kind of Enlightenment naturalism. And we remember Rousseau, for example. And Tom is the innocent sort of country boy. He's humble. And so that's part of his appeal. And he's also uninhibited. These other guys are so uptight about everything that they won't let themselves, have flings and stuff. And Tom is a sort of natural guy. So that's a sort of joke at and satire of these self-important classistas who Fielding is satirizing. So you see what's happening in the century in England is that rising middle class, increasingly skeptical of the prerogatives of the upper class. And so here you see they find him on the doorstep. Obviously, either Squire Allworthy or one of the other men of the house is probably responsible for him. You see the kind of skeptical look on the ancestor in the painting, and the lady saying in the engraving there on the title page, saying, "Oh my, a baby, what could it be?" Tom Jones, the opinions and history of Tom Jones, a foundling, but now clearly a novel by Henry Fielding. And the last one then that we'll do here, Lawrence Sterne, another person. If you're a literature person, if that's your bag, then you definitely need to write down Lawrence Sterne and go take another look at him. A church person, a churchman like Jonathan Swift, and an Anglo-Irish churchman who spent a lot of time in Ireland like Jonathan Swift. So that's something that's interesting about the two of them. And he also wrote an anonymous poem, a political romance, which attacked people. It was sort of an attack on maybe Anglican sort of popish posturing, satirizing clergymen and all the robes and stuff. Anyway, it didn't go over well. That was sort of the end of things for him after 20 years in the church, right? But it was gathered by and burned. However, that was really a good thing because that was the same year when he finally stopped being a clergyman altogether, that he realized that he could make people laugh. He said, this is what he said, that he could make people laugh with his writing, which he hadn't quite realized. And he started serializing the life and opinions of Tristram Shandy, gentleman, which was a huge success almost immediately, made him rich and famous, and which he enjoyed tremendously. So that was his story. We're going to read about it in a sec here, about the story on the next slide. One thing, I'll try and find a good link to it. Ignacio Sancho, a black man of African descent who was born on a slave ship, but who ended up being an abolitionist activist in England in the 18th century of some repute. And he had one of a number of very interesting black people in England in the 1700s, I might add. And he wrote to Sterne, and he wrote to Sterne saying, Mr. Sterne, won't you please, raise your voice up against slavery, anti-slavery activist. And the morning that Sterne got the letter, he'd just been writing a scene for a book about someone mistreating a slave girl in his shop. So he took that to be an important coincidence. And so they went and have a correspondence, and that correspondence got to be pretty famous in this anti-slavery abolitionist activity, which really starts to heat up in the late 1700s and early 1800s. As we're going to see right now, in the last two slides of our presentation today, Sterne really anticipating all kinds of writing for about 150 years later, in fact. And to be specific, for example, the Brazilian modernist Machado de Assis, who wrote a book called Philosopher or Dog, which as a philosopher I recommend, and probably his most famous novel is, these are written in Portuguese originally, the posthumous memoirs of Brás Cubas. And in that he uses this digressive technique of Tristram Shandy. And Tristram Shandy, they're going from one topic to another topic to another topic to another topic, like I sometimes do in class. Why do they do that? Well, for one thing, he's making fun of John Locke's psychology. Remember, Locke and Hume and the other empiricists had a very simple psychology, and they said, well, there's sort of association and similarity. So there's the association of ideas. And they thought, well, maybe you move from one thought to another through just this association of ideas. Also notice they're looking for automatic explanations that don't have a lot of intentionality to them. So Sterne is making fun of that because these people, every time they think of something, they have to explain it, and their ideas are constantly running off, and they're running off to the horizon. They never get around to it. It's supposed to be Tristram Shandy telling you his life, but his mother is actually having a very difficult labor in the other room. But before the doctor will go in to see her, he's sitting smoking a pipeful and having a conversation about the latest military techniques and innovations with his host, while she suffers. For the first 3 volumes of it, Tristram isn't even born till volume 3. And he doesn't ever really manage to get around to telling you very much about his own life, because everything he thinks of, he has to explain it, talk about something else. So you have a combination of a parody of the new science and a sort of parody of these attitudes. And the other thing about Tristram Shandy as a running serial that people enjoyed, his readers would also recognize his parodies of famous poets of the time, and even Jonathan Swift he parodied. But these poets like Alexander Pope wrote these very complex and very grandiose kinds of things that the public liked, and they were easy to parody. As they say in that last bullet point on the slide there, he objects, among other things, to this kind of self-seriousness. And I think that's part of why he wants to play with the medium. Again, one thing about all of these writers is that they're just coming into the time of the novel. They're not self-consciously following the rules of the novel. And so one of the things that Sterne does is he uses these kinds of graphic tricks. Let's talk about his metanarrative techniques. I mentioned the digressions. the digressions which are, but digressions to the point of being nutty, right? Digressions which just take you off and they don't ever bring you back. So the novel is kind of sort of spreading out and spreading out, and where does it end? I think we see that in sort of late 20th century big novels, people like Pynchon or Don DeLillo, people like that, or information-based novels where, you know, the information is kind of pouring out. And that's also this Enlightenment age of reason sense that Sterne's getting with these digressions and double meanings and various other kinds of puns. And then, and graphic tricks. Graphic tricks, let me show you some. Let me step out of this for a second. And I'm going to try and got my handy dandy copy of Tristram Shandy right here. And he'll do stuff like have a blank page. Remember, this is what the readers were looking at in the 1700s. Or maybe, you know, marbled end papers just in the middle of everything. Sometimes it'll be finis and it'll have the end just right in the middle. Or he'll say, well, this chapter has been omitted for the sake of brevity. I don't have time to tell you what was in this chapter. Lists of things, endless lists of things, which is very modernist, also very modernist kind of thing to do. A lot of experimental writers in the 20th century will get into that stuff. And even just, you know, using advantage of the medium just to say, you know, well, we can just have squiggles and squaggles and stuff. And this is also bringing the reader in, which is another thing we see later on with modernist writers. Julio Cortázar with his novel Hopscotch, for example, the Argentine modernist novelist. So, and then the other thing is, if you're telling a story and then you run into some, and then you think of some other story and say, oh, but that was the time that, and so after a while, you've got one story over here, and then you've got another story. When you're done with that story, you're getting you back to that story. But again, he just takes that out to sort of a dizzying place. Those graphic tricks I mentioned, third bullet point there, again, bringing you in and also showing you that the medium is just the medium, right? And not to take it too seriously and not to believe everything you see. He certainly is influenced by Cervantes, who he references very frequently throughout the book. And remember, it's that second volume of Cervantes where Cervantes gets into all this meta-narrative stuff. So this is a lot of stuff that we characterize with, as I say, modernist writers of the turn of the century from the 1890s to like the 1930s, people like James Joyce, Gertrude Stein do the kind of things that Lawrence Sterne does in Tristram Shandy. So it really is a very remarkable cultural artifact indeed, and it's also a very entertaining thing to read. Okay, what else do we got here? Yeah. He says, this is from Tristram Shandy. He's supposed to describe the widow Waman. This widow is hanging out with him. And possibly, gentle reader, with such a temptation, so wouldst thou, for never did thy eyes behold, or thy concupiscence covet, anything in this world more concupiscible than the widow Wadman. I mean, hubba hubba. And so he says this. He says, to conceive this right then, get yourself a pen and ink, and I'll leave this page blank, and paint her in your own mind. And, you know, I want you to paint her as much like your mistress, he says, as unlike your wife. It's not PC. Please put your own fancy in it. Okay. They, among other things, they invent little mini cannons that are powered by the hookahs, by the water power. He's always making fun of some real invention that maybe might be in the paper, right? And he'll make fun of it by coming up with a crazy example. But then they get interested in the hookahs, in smoking what's in the hookahs, the water pipes, right? So they get to smoking the hookahs and blow all the ammunition out of all the cannons. You can see there in the engraving on the left there, the sort of caricatures of these goofy Enlightenment Englishmen who are lost in all of their digressions and their crazy science, like the crazy scientists up on the floating city in Jonathan Swift. So the artists starting to have their say about the Enlightenment. So as I say, this is a really nice period of English literature. There's all kinds of, it's not formulaic. These are not novels in the modern sense of the word, although by the end of the century, people like Fielding and Smollett were writing what we certainly would call novels. They are developing this idea in the same way that theater back in classic times had to develop the idea of the character, that the character was an actor playing someone else. And that kind of understanding what that means and how you sort of negotiate that is what's going on with these people trying to figure out the novel in the 1700s. I particularly recommend Swift and Sterne. But if you want to, for example, marinate yourself in the language of the time, get some of those novels by Fielding and Smollett, and Samuelson is another one, and read those. And that very curious document by Daniel Defoe, and that wily Daniel Defoe in that life that he lived. I tell you. Anyway, so some literature, yeah, and that's worth exploring too. And you could even do some reading. Wouldn't hurt you. Okay. Anyway, sorry. I know you do your reading. Some of you actually. Never mind. The more I talk, the more bigger of an ass I am. Isn't it true?